Welcome back to the class, everyone. Today we're going to be talking about roster building once again, and more specifically, the fastest and easiest teams that you can farm. This video is meant as a continuation of our first video, which you can check out over there. But that being said, why are we doing a continuation of that video? Was that not supposed to be the fastest and easiest 5 or 6 teams that you can farm? Yes, it was. That being said, at a certain point, you are going to need to farm more than 5 or 6 teams. And if you also want it to be quick and you don't have time to settle down for something large like a really long legendary journey or even a galactic legend, these teams are really kind of meant to fill that void both in GAC and outside of it. Last time we tended to focus on GAC a little bit. So going over our criteria from our last video, one of the things that we wanted to talk about is not only teams that were easy to access, but also actually were good. The teams must be relevant. That is kind of the criteria we're working with. We were looking for accelerated shards, low to no Kairos, because a lot of the gear is accelerated that isn't Cairo right now, as well as no legendary change. The criteria is going to change just slightly in the second video, and that is because we have to change it to be able to list different teams. So we're going to be talking a little bit about low-level legendaries, and you'll see a lot of examples when we get into it. Ones that can be unlocked without having to gear up or even relic up a bunch of other characters that don't even end up on the team. And one other thing that isn't listed out here, because we didn't list it last time, is that we're going to be talking about teams that have a lot less characters that you can get through the stores, and that is going to make an impact because the stores are the easiest way you can get characters because you don't have to double dip between gear or other sources like that. So with that being said, let's go ahead and get actually to the teams themselves. So first off is going to be like a boss, and that is going to be the boss team. And this team was actually mentioned in the comments of the last video if anyone went there to explore, saying how this is also another really accessible team that you can get up that can actually pay dividends, and you'll need it in some fashion to get Chewbacca. The reason why my face made those expressions was because you do not need this good of a bounty hunter team to unlock Chewbacca. It can be done with significantly less, and you really don't arguably even need any of these characters. Maybe Dengar, he's pretty nice. Bosk is too. That being said, this team can punch up very high, and they don't need a ton of gear. And you already see here, we're starting to move our criteria in the sense that Grief and the Mandalorian both want more Kyrotech. I know we've talked about little to none. They don't need as much as some other teams, but the team here is still primarily using a lot of that old gear, so it can be built up. Again, not as fast as Geos or as Night Sisters like we talked about in the last video, but it can be built up. One thing that is or needs to be said about this team as well, you do want a pretty significant speed investment in it. Doesn't need to be that high because Zam herself and her unique and her Omicron, she is going to give a huge amount of speed to the rest of the team. We won't go into all the math that involves, but it typically yields about 60 or 70 depending on how fast you make her. But then Bosk and Grief also need to be up there. The reason why I do like Bosk and not Bosk, Grief and Mando to be a little bit geared again with that Kyrotech is because once you get your first annihilate off, which that's kind of how this team works, you go before everyone else, you get contract, you annihilate a key character like Dash or Bam or even Darth Revan or something like that. And then you actually do have to take quite a few hits. You can't just be kind of paper. Like we talked quite a bit about troopers in our last battle. They can pretty much be paper because the enemy team oftentimes never takes a turn, with Veers constantly gaining turn meter. This one, the enemy typically does gain turn meter at some point, so you do want to have a little bit of gear on them. So Bosk's the first team up. Really amazing offensive team, but can also be used on defense. Next up is going to be Padme. The reason why we're not talking about Jedi Anakin here is because we already talked about him in the Qui-Gon Jinn team. We're trying not to have too much overlap, so we can really consider these genuine teams within themselves. That being said, this is our first legendary that we're talking about. Padme is very accessible within her event. You do not need a specific team or high relics or like a key character to be able to beat the event. It is beatable with Geos. It is beatable with a Newt team. Way back in the day when I did it, I used a R1 Grievous and literally garbage. So you can get her pretty easily without having to invest Kyrotechs or a bunch of hard nodes or something like that. So you can get her that way, and then even the rest of her team, General Kenobi, as long as you're in a somewhat decent guild that is getting those shards, you're able to get him as well. Albeit he is very heavy on Carboni. When he first came out, we called him General Carbonti. And then Ahsoka, Mason, R2 are also pretty accessible. With R2 does require a really low level Empire team to unlock him. And then they're just honestly quite good. The team, if you're going up against a fairly good player, they'll know how to handle it. CLS can tackle the team really well. Jedi Knight Revan tackles the team really well. Imperial Troopers, in fact, tackle the team really well without Jedi Anakin. But if you're going up against someone who doesn't really understand all the nuances in it, like you don't want to attack out of turn a lot, or you want to focus on a specific character, it can end really poorly, or let say you're using Moff Gideon, you drop your own turn meter, and their turn meter doesn't drop, and then they just eat you alive. So there are a lot of ways for this to be screwed up, especially as a defensive team. It can be used on offense. Mace's max health reduction, which, by the way, he doesn't really require all 3 of his Zetas, but they are nice. With him constantly reducing the team's max health and defense, the team can get through some really solid stuff. Padme used to have the issue of timing out against things like crew and whatnot. Now it's just not a thing because of Mace actually being able to do that. So overall, really good team. R2 isn't also, like, you don't have to have him in there. I think he's probably one that most people have built up, even if he's only gear 12 or something of the sort. Next up are the Old Republic. This was another team that actually got talked about in the comments in our last video, and it really is kind of around that low level spark. While we do have 2 legendaries in here, really, I guess a hero's journey and a legendary for one to be specific, they're both really easy to unlock once you get past the actual hard nodes of Bastila Fallen and Jolie, which again, we talked about this in the very beginning of the video, that one of the leanings that we were going to have for these teams is going to be going into harder nodes rather than just going through the store. So, and once you get Jedi Knight Revan, you'll already have 3 Jedi already done, and then you just have to build 2 other Jedi, which is really easy to be able to get Grandmaster Yoda up to 7 stars and make him usable for the squad. Old Ben is not a requirement for this. I like him because you do double dip along with CLS and then eventually for Galactic Legends later on. But this can be other Jedi. Hoda's another good one. I didn't want to put Hoda in here though, because get 1 characters are really, even now, kind of just for newer and mid-game players, kind of the epitome of just not being accessible. They're so hard to get, they take so long, and they're often very good. But old Ben will do just as fine as Hoda. You could even use GK here if you weren't using our Padme squad. But very good squad on both offense and defense, at least in 5v5. And 3v3 is a little bit better on offense, just with the amount of things he's able to take down. And even as you progress in your roster, once you get Galactic Legends and much of the like, you start just putting them with Jedi Knight Revan. Like, Jedi Master Luke goes very well with Jedi Knight Revan, as does Jedi Knight Luke. He just has not lost a lot of viability over time, especially with his Mark and Savior mechanics. So, very good team, can kill a lot of stuff, particularly Grievous is another one. Next one is going to be Treya. So, again, disclaimer before we get into the nitty and gritty of what Treya can do. You don't need Savage here, you don't need an R7 Marauder, and you don't need 2 Omicrons. I know that was one of the things that was expressed in our last video too, is that Omicrons are really hard to come by. We don't have a constant inflow of them from always getting 2 from the GCs. So you don't need that to happen. Realistically, the Sith trio alone here, without 1 Omicron, is already accessible enough and very good. We have a lot of hard nodes here. Treya herself is a raid character, but again, very similar to the GK that we talked about just a few moments ago. If you're in a semi-decent guild, you should already be getting those shards. You should have her 7 stars. It's just going to come down to a factor of being able to lock them. The only thing that I will say about this, and this kind of reflects a little bit of the Night Sisters in our last video, they're not the best building block squad. And what I mean by that is, and this is very different from the rest of the squads that we've either seen in the past one, and we'll even see in the next video if we make it later on, they're not required for any Galactic Legends down the line. And when you're building a roster, there's really those 2 things you want to constantly pay attention to. Is the squad or the character I'm working on now, A, is it good? And B, what is it going to get me later on? So if we look at the Jedi Knight Revan team we just talked about, Grandmaster Yoda, he's required to be able to get JMK. Old Ben is required to get JML. If we go to the Padme squad, Padme is required to get Lord Vader. GK is required to get JMK. Mace is too. R2-D2 is required to get JML. So we have all these squads, I guess they're for Chewbacca, they end up being required for things later on. The Treya team, that's really her only defect, is that she doesn't really build anything larger. Her value kind of stops within herself. That's not necessarily a terrible thing. It's just something we need to keep in mind when we're talking about roster building. That being said, she is amazing. This exact comp right now on defense is just causing terrors across the board. It is very hard to take down. We have not, I don't believe we've one-shot it yet. We've been trying to use Qui-Gon Jinn, but with the defense crons, it's been very hard. But even at a lower level, they kill a lot of squads you will very commonly see. I just don't see Treya ever going out of style. When they originally made her kit, it was actually the first meta that I ever played with. I guess we're talking a lot about history here. Her main 2 mechanics is that she constantly dispels debuffs across her team, and she punishes the enemy team for attacking out of turn. So many teams, as the game progresses, just have 1 unit that is constantly assisting at a turn, or the entire team is assisting at a turn, like Mon Mothma or Geos. But it just makes her value go up and up and up. And then even the increase on debuffs, I feel like over time, debuffs have just run rampant. We've seen a lot with teams like Sith Empire, as well as Bad Batch, and the number just keeps getting higher and higher, and then she just uses that all to her advantage. Again, even without the Omicron, even in TW, she has regained a lot of use. And then just being anti-revive, the anti-revive mechanics that both her and Nihilus have are also very nice for handling teams that like to revive a lot, like Dash or like Night Sisters. And speaking of Dash, he is going to be our final team now. This one is a little bit hard to swallow as well, just because, as I previously mentioned earlier in the video, all of these characters, or rather none of these characters, can be bought through the shop. You have to get all of them either through Cantina or Hard Node, which does make them a little bit harder to get. Dash himself also does require Cairo. You don't need, in fact, you don't really want Lando here. I just picked Lando because he was a random light side scoundrel ally that I had laying around that was fairly accessible. And I guess you do need him for other things for both Jedi Knight Luke and Jedi Master Luke. That being said, you do want to try to keep this team, if possible, as much light side as possible, just because, we just said possible twice there. Vander Chewbacca can only revive light side scoundrels, so you can put dark side characters in here. We've done Embo before, and he does all right. The Omicron is not mandatory. It does make the team better. There are a few specific scenarios where that becomes important. Another option for this team that you can throw in there, typically as a defensive measure, is Quill and IG. I didn't want to bring them up for this video though, or put them in the ideal squad, just because they do require Cairo, and this team does become more expensive. And Dash, very similar to what we were talking about with some of the other squads, excluding Treya, is he's actually needed for Star Killer. So eventually, we will make another video talking again about, we have the fastest teams you can farm. This is kind of a mid-range, and eventually we'll get on to the squads that require a little bit more playing, a little bit more investment, a little bit more time. And the squad that's going to be in there is going to be Star Killer. So Dash is kind of building up to that, and I guess in a way we're kind of working on building a farming guard of our own. But let me know what you guys think. Let me know what we missed, what other teams might be around this area, or really might even be better than the ones we listed. But until the next time, stay awesome.